Strand.
Popcorn therapy. Holistic health and wellness through the lens of pop culture. Okay, so welcome back to Popcorn Therapy. We're going to be talking about Dune today, the movies, and The Madonna Secret, which is a book by Sophie Strand. And our theme today is going to be looking at spirituality and religion, maybe spirituality versus religion, through the lens of these movies and this book. So I'm kind of assuming that you've seen Dune. I'm talking about the recent Dune movies, and really most specifically Dune Part 2, because I think this one shows a lot more of the religious imagery around the Bene Gesserit and what they mean. The Madonna Secret you may or may not have heard of. It's a newer book by Sophie Strand, who, you know, if you know her, you've probably read all her books. If you don't know her, you're about to. So I'm going to do a little recap about these two pieces of literature, and then we'll talk about their meanings. So let's go with Dune first. Again, I'm assuming that you've probably seen it, but I'm going to give you a little recap anyway. So the major characters are Paul Atreides and his mother, Jessica. So Jessica is a part of the Bene Gesserit, which is this sort of religious group that holds a lot of power in the society that I'm going to talk about lots more in this episode. And Paul is kind of being placed in this messiah position on the planet of Arrakis, where there's a very valuable substance called spice that's needed for intergalactic travel. Interesting little piece of trivia. I don't know if you caught this in watching the two movies, but spice is valuable not because it's some sort of oil. It's sort of presented as oil. It's not like a substance that powers an intergalactic spaceship. It's actually valuable because it gets the navigators high enough that they can know where they're going. That's what spice is. Okay. So just in case you weren't clear, that's what we're talking about here. So there's a lot of power around who gets to have access to drilling for spice, which is sort of obviously a metaphor for drilling for oil, on Arrakis, which is like Iraq. It's just kind of like a funny, very obvious sort of name for the planet. And throughout these movies, we kind of watch Paul going through his adventures of being this messiah or not, and, you know, how the different players work with power throughout this universe and throughout this story. The movies are really beautiful. I much prefer Dune 2 to Dune 1. Dune 1 just kind of sets it all up. It's quite beautiful as well. But Dune 2 really has a lot more of that detail into what the Bene Gesserit is doing. It has a lot of imagery that's actually very mindfully and specifically influenced by Egyptian religious art and other religious art as well. The costumes were really intended to be a mix between inspired by religious art and Balenciaga, like fashion, high fashion couture. And I think it does actually a really, really good job of that. The costumes are incredible. Now, The Madonna Secret by Sophie Strand is a fictionalized memoir by Mary Magdalene, who is a figure that we don't really know that much about necessarily in the lore. And so Sophie Strand really tells her story of her life. And the way that this author explains it is that she reroutes the story into those lands at that time. So the book is very sensual. It's very focused on the trees that were living at the time, the fruits and breads that people were eating, what the sand felt like underneath their feet. It's very rooted, really, I guess is the right word for it, and it's very land-oriented. So Sophie Strand also studies ecology. She studies storytelling and ecology. She has an incredible mind. She's definitely somebody that I would have over for dinner and just listen to her talk all night because she's a fascinating person. And the reason that I'm bringing together these two quite different pieces to talk about them in the same podcast is that they both explore and work with the Messiah narrative, right? So Paul Atreides it's really quite a thinly veiled version of Christianity in the Dune universe. And of course, Mary Magdalene's memoir tells the story of, in the case of this book, Mary Magdalene growing up and having, her name's Miriam in the book, and having these healing powers and having this connection to like the leopards and the serpents, which is an ancient symbol of the goddess. The pre-patriarchal goddess was always associated with the serpent. She has a really cool relationship with vultures who actually rescue her from a near violation at a certain point. It's very, very satisfying scene, but she has a special connection with these wild animals. And eventually she meets Jesus, who's called Yeshua in this story, and the two fall in love and they become lovers and they get married, and she witnesses what happens with Jesus, who becomes the Messiah, in a way that I think is really fascinating, because she's looking at it from the perspective of like, okay, Jesus, Yeshua, has these messages. He has the same healing capacities that she has, but they are in a patriarchal world where people don't really believe that a woman could have those kinds of powers or don't respect her for having that. They see her as, Miriam of the seven devils, like she's possessed. It's not a good thing that she has this healing capacity. But when Jesus, Yeshua, does it, of course, then it's a miracle, and this is the Son of God and all those things. And so she kind of watches the men misunderstand this message and take it on, noticing that it's something that they can use for their own power, which is another theme that comes up in Dune. And so a lot of the way Miriam witnesses what happens with Jesus as the Messiah and so on, it's really quite beautiful, because there's something really personal about it and very love-based. There's a lot of, mistakes that everybody makes. It's very human. And her perspective is one that I think is so valuable, which is, I think the way she kind of encapsulates Jesus' message is the kingdom is here, in the river, in the land, in the fruits, in the grain, in sex, actually, in loving each other, in having children, family, and in all of those things, in breaking bread, and she sort of witnesses people taking this message in some really wrong directions. So I'm going to go back to Dune 2 for a second. I've already mentioned there are some sort of like heavy metaphors, Arrakis, Iraq, spice as oil. Also the Fremen want to be free men, which I find is just like, it's a little heavy on the metaphors here. And again, I'm talking about the movies. I tried to read the first book once. It was too heavy for me. My husband is obsessed with these books. He's read them all, I think. So he knows a lot more about this than I do, but I'm just speaking from the movie perspective. And I thought a couple of those pieces were quite funny. Another funny piece that I just sort of adored about this movie was Javier Bardem is playing Stilgar, who's this Fremen character who has this religious belief that in the prophecy that the Messiah is going to come. And he believes that Paul is this Messiah as it's been written. And every time he sees Paul do something that's close to what the prophecy said, he has this gleeful grin on his face and he goes, it is written, like it's the best thing that's ever happened to him. Like this really sweet moment of like, ooh, my stories are coming to life. This is so exciting. So there's something just a little silly about this movie that I appreciate about it. I love a little silliness, especially within the sort of heavy music score and the really intense themes of this movie. There's some pretty heavy violence. There's some underlying themes too that I didn't really know about when I was watching the movie, but apparently it's a bit more apparent in the book. There's some incest going on. There's some inappropriate sort of family dynamics within the Harkonnens that's a bit disturbing. And so, that's all there too. We like a little silliness to sort of mix and match with our heaviness. Okay, so one of the things Dune 2, or Dune, I guess both of them are doing, is warning about the danger of the savior or messiah story. So some of you might know of sort of white saviorism as an example of this idea that one person can go in and solve all of the problems of another place. And the white messiah is a specifically quite colonial perspective where you have someone who has had a lot of power coming into a place that is new to them and saying, I know how this should be. I'm going to be the one to make the rules now because I know what's best for you. And that colonial energy is very much like, I'm telling you the way and it comes from my way and I'm not to be questioned. The more indigenous perspective that we miss when we do that, which we've done many, many times over and over again. And Dune is also in part a story about colonialism too. When we do that, we miss the indigenous wisdom, which is listening. It's paying attention from an indigenous perspective, which I think is displayed a little bit within the Fremen. It's about this deep listening to, how things connect, right? So not only to, let's take the sandworms as an example. So sandworms are really interesting in the Dune universe. They're terrifying, like they're a monster, especially to the colonists who are coming in and trying to take over this land for its resources, which is the colonial thing. But the Fremen, through listening and paying attention, have figured out how to kind of work with the sandworms, to understand them a little bit better and to have a sort of symbiosis with them. So in general, that indigenous perspective is really about listening and learning from, rather than telling you how it's going to go, which is that colonial energy. So the savior, the white savior, comes in and says, like, I'm going to fix this all for you. So in the Dune universe, the prophecy has been planted by the Bene Gesserit many generations ago. And what is super interesting about the Bene Gesserit that I learned when I was researching for this episode is that they're actually not a religious group. They pretend to be. So they are sort of an organization or a society that is working ostensibly for the good of humanity. And they're doing this through all kinds of power moves and even breeding, so genetic modification, essentially. And they have this big plan to create the Kwisatz Haderach, the Messiah person. And the kink in that movement is that Jessica, Paul's mom, is a Bene Gesserit who theoretically has the ability to choose the gender of her child, and she's been told to have a female child, but she has a male one. Reasons not totally known. And so the Messiah person essentially comes a generation early. So the Bene Gesserit are really mad at her for doing this, because they were supposed to wait for her to have a daughter, and then that daughter was going to have the Messiah with a Harkonnen, which is interesting. The Harkonnens are like big enemies in this movie, in case that wasn't clear. They're the real scary villains. So there's a moment when Chani, who is one of the Fremen, really speaks up against this Messiah thing. She says something like, if you give the people a Messiah, if you tell them to wait, they'll wait forever. And the idea with that is that it disempowers the people to fight for themselves, to make their own way, to make their own world, because they're just waiting for someone to come along and, make a better world for them, right? And this is very much one of the things that can happen within the Christian religious perspective, which is that idea of, Jesus is going to come back, he's going to take us all of the good ones and leave all the bad ones, the kingdom is going to come, all of these things. And when you're sort of waiting for something like that to happen, you're not really present, right, with what's going on with you. And in the Madonna Secret, so much of what she's trying to express is that the kingdom is here. Again, it's about being present with what is. Like, this is being on this earth is the gift. And that's what we're kind of missing when we're focusing on this idea of somebody needing to save us. One of the things that I think is so interesting about this whole savior idea is that in the context of the Dune universe, the Bene Gesserit are planning to make Arrakis a water world. And this is something that the people really want. They have this sort of long-term plan to make it a water world. They really want water and all these things. But there are so many moments throughout the movies where you notice just how beautiful and amazing Arrakis is. And Chani says it at a certain point, like at a certain time of day or at sunset or something like that, Arrakis is incredibly beautiful. And, in order to save, quote unquote, save these people, we're going to essentially destroy the world that they've come to thrive on and make it what we think it should be, which is a water world, because that's what we know and that's what we think is good, right? So again, it's that colonial perspective coming in, and the Fremen are really down with that. They agree with that because they've had this religious indoctrination essentially telling them desert is bad, water is good. Like, who decided that, right? At what point was that decided? Because there's so much beauty on Arrakis, and I think part of what we're watching as we watch this movie is observing Paul fall in love with not only Chani but also the Fremen and Arrakis as it is, and the sandworms, and that the world that he's being introduced to, which is quite different from where he comes from, which is a water world. So the Bene Gesserit are Bene Gesserit. I mean, it's, again, this really heavy, obvious metaphors tying this story to Christianity. But it's interesting that the Bene Gesserit are really, they're a women's order. So it's sisters, it's a sisterhood. It's women who have the power. There are a lot of moments where they say, like, a man will die if he drinks the water of life. And, women, you have to have female babies, all these things. So they're kind of this matriarchal society, again, only religious to the outside world, right? Using that religious perspective to gain more power, but ultimately they're sort of like trained spies. Like, they're trained to do all kinds of cool things, to have these interesting powers, but it's all for this larger perspective, which is decided by the Reverend Mother Superior, or the Superior Reverend Mother, something like that. There's like one person who kind of decides how this is supposed to go. And one of the powers they have is that they have the memories of all the Reverend Mothers before them, all the way back apparently to when humans were on Earth before the scattering, which is how people ended up on different planets all over the universe. And so theoretically, these memories, this understanding of the past, would allow this person to know what the future should be. But again, who gets to decide that? How is that decided? What does that all mean? So part of the reason I'm so interested in both Dune and the Madonna Secret is because I actually just finished writing a book on goddesses throughout different cultures and throughout the ages, this divine feminine and how it's evolved. And one of the things that I found really fascinating is that there is this idea that the cultures all over the world were matriarchal before patriarchy sort of invaded, before certain people came in and took over certain cultures and inserted themselves into those cultures. So, for example, in pre-Hellenic Greece, Demeter, Hera, Persephone, Pandora, these were all goddesses that were worshipped before the northern invaders came in and introduced the concept of Zeus. And then they sort of mythologically had Zeus marry Hera and create this sort of new melding of the cultures. But before that, it was just the female goddesses. And there's evidence that the goddess was worshipped all over the world before any male gods came into it. The male gods were often the goddesses like son or lover sometimes, but the goddess was often supreme. And so a lot of people have speculated, were these cultures matriarchal? And if they were matriarchal, what does that mean, right? So one thing would have meant that women would have had sexual agency. They could have had sex however they wanted to with whoever they wanted to, theoretically. And that the children would be raised by the village and it wouldn't really matter who the father was. So one theory is that when these patriarchal religions started to come in, they had to essentially teach sexual shame because they needed to be able to track who the baby's daddy was. This is what they needed to know. So in order to achieve that, they needed to teach women that sex was sinful except with your lawfully married husband and so on. And that's where a lot of our history of that sexual shame came from. So, the truth is, though, we don't really know. We don't know what a matriarchal society would have looked like. We don't know if women's lives were any better. There is some evidence that men were sacrificed to the goddess, as like the king would reign for a year and then be sacrificed, to the fertility of the land and so on. Like maybe those worlds were really horrible for men. We just don't really know. There's only so much information we have about them. But I think the Bene Gesserit are so interesting in this way because here we see this sisterhood of very powerful women, but they're working in a very patriarchal way, colonial way, right? In the sense that they have decided that their way is the best way. In that sort of evil mother, I guess, kind of perspective, like, I know what's best for you, and so I'm going to get in the way of you making any other kinds of decisions. And, one of the ways that they do their work is that they have this voice, which causes people to comply. And I think that's, again, an interesting metaphor because so much of the way the Christian religion causes people to comply is through voice, right? It's through preaching, it's through teaching, charismatic leaders. And there are many cults that work in this way where it's through voice, through charismatic leaders that people are converted and they end up, doing what they're told because of this sort of preaching quality, right? It sort of steals somebody's ability to think for themselves, which is what the Bene Gesserit voice does. It takes away that person's agency and sort of fills in their will with that person's thoughts. So when we look at the methods of what the Bene Gesserit is doing, especially towards the end of Dune 2, where we see that a holy war is starting, and through drinking the water of life, which is a hallucinogenic substance, Paul comes to see that he has to be involved in this war. He has to allow a lot of people to die in order, again, to get water onto Arrakis. So, Jessica's happy about this. This Bene Gesserit sisterhood is happy about this. Like, they want this holy war. They can see this as best. And we can also look at how often holy wars have been waged, right? How often religious powers have said, this is the way, this is the best way. We have to eradicate this people that are bad for us, that don't work for what we want in the future. And so we're going to wage this holy war and kind of say that the war is in the name of this God that we've decided. And therefore, it's okay to be killing all of these people. There's even some of this in the Bible, which, forgive my ignorance, I grew up Christian, not super religious, but I went to church for a long time. I went to Sunday school and I studied the Bible a little bit in university, but I didn't really understand some of the context of it until I started writing this book about goddesses and looking at Mary, the Virgin Mary, as a goddess and Eve as a goddess, and kind of looking at the context a bit more of where this writing came from. And a lot of the Old Testament, what it does is it's telling the story of God's people trying to eradicate the goddesses' people, essentially. Ashtoreth and her Baal is the sort of one of the maybe demons, is how you might think of that, or Astarte. It turns out this is a goddess's name. It's probably related to Ishtar, actually, or Isis, who her older version is Inanna. This is a really old goddess worshipping religion that was kind of around at the time, And so the holy war was going into these towns, killing all the men, and then taking the women on as concubines or wives or whatever, and creating new families. So we can think again of that connection between the Zeus worshippers coming in and forcing that marriage to Hera. And now when you think of the goddess Hera, if you remember, she's pretty bitchy. She's very jealous. She does a lot of punishing. But if we look at it from that perspective, we're like, okay, this was a forced, unhappy, arranged marriage, and she was once the queen of this land, and now she has to share that power with this dude who came in from out of nowhere. Like, no wonder she's a bit pissed off, right? And so it's written in the Bible. There are some parts in there that say, if you, I can't quote it off the top of my head, but it says something like, if you take down and eradicate these people, but there's a woman that you find attractive, you can take her into your home and shave her head and take away all her clothes and make sure she never mentions her mother and father again, and then you can take her on as her wife or whatever it is. And it's disturbing that we think of the Bible as the book of it's our Jewish religion, it's our Christian religion. It's certainly intended to come from a place of love and spirituality and these really good values that I think these religions do at least intend to embody. But what's actually in there is like, you can kill people, if I tell you to. And that's kind of what the Bene Gesserit does. They don't really seem to mind too much who dies along the way of them getting what they want. So I suppose this, of course, could be some misogyny from the original writer of Dune, who maybe saw the idea of women in power as really abhorrent, that if women in power, this is what they would do with it. It's possible, again, it's we don't really know necessarily what the meaning of that is. And I think by the end of Dune 2, it's ambiguous if the Bene Gesserit are kind of overall good or bad. We sort of have this sense of like, okay, some bad stuff is going to happen, but there's going to be a good at the end. But again, that good is decided by someone who, how does it feel for you when somebody says like, I've decided what's best for you, so this is what you're doing, and you don't get to make your own decisions about that. Especially having indoctrinated the Fremen into this, religious prophecy and so on to essentially get them on board with that. So to whose benefit is it really to make Arrakis a water world? Like, is that to the benefit of the Fremen, or is it to the benefit of the Bene Gesserit in some sort of longer term way? We don't really know at the end. I think it's held a little bit ambiguous, which I think is quite interesting. So, I'm really fascinated by the Bene Gesserit as this sort of powerful women, matriarchal religious culture, but also, sort of sociopathic, evil breeding programs. Like it's a, just pretending to be religious to get people on their side, but actually know that they're not doing that. They're more like spies and, this sort of secret society, this they're the man, capital M, I suppose, in the universe of Dune. They're the emperor, they're the empire when it comes down to it. The emperor only does what he does because he's essentially been told to do that by the Reverend Mother's voice. And so, again, who's really holding the power here? So I think that whole dynamic is just so fascinating. Okay, so I want to give you a little bit more background on some of the stuff that I learned while I was researching, specifically the Virgin Mary as someone who is holding the goddess position in the Bible and how that relates to Dune and also the Madonna Secret. So you may or may not know that a lot of the lore about Mary comes from apocryphal sources. So these are writings that were not included in the canonical Bible. They were written elsewhere. So the Gospel of James is the one that has a lot of the backstory of who Mary is. And in this backstory, there's so much interesting stuff here, but she was born to a barren couple. And one of the things that's interesting about this is that the quote-unquote virgin birth is actually really common throughout the Bible, and it was a common motif in Greek mythology at the time as well. That idea that a woman would be impregnated by a god and then give birth to a hero. Hercules is one of the many in Greek mythology, which was certainly present at the time of the New Testament writings, at least. So anyway, Mary is born to this barren couple who essentially prays and offers that, if we can just have this child, we'll offer it into the service of God forever. So when she's 3 years old, Mary goes to live in the temple. And this is a point of some controversy because some people say, oh yeah, that would have been normal. Like there were temple virgins who would, help out with the temple things, and they would, weave the sacred veils and things like that. And others say, no, in Jewish religion at the time, there's no way women would be living with men in a temple sort of situation. But she's essentially a temple virgin. That's kind of how it's understood. And she lives there with other temple virgins who are devoted to the service of God. And of course, today we have temple virgins who are nuns, right, in the Catholic Church. So as this young temple virgin, Mary is having a great time. She dances on the steps of the temple, which is where the sacrifices are done. So it's a little foreshadowing for you there. And she eats food out of the hand of an angel. An angel comes and hangs out with her all the time. And when she gets close to her time of menstruation, the temple priest decides that she needs to be married. And so he's not sure what to do. He loves Mary. He's not sure if she should stay or what. And so he gets a message from God that he should tell all the widowers of the town to come and put their staffs on the altar. And so they do so, and one of the staffs flowers, which is so sweet. And of course, this is Joseph's staff. He is of the house of David, and a dove lands on his shoulder to say this is the one. So they get married, but he's older. He's already got children. He doesn't have any interest in Mary sexually at this point. He's more so like, I'll protect this young girl, and she can continue to kind of serve God in my house, in this pure way. So Joseph leaves to go be a carpenter wherever he's a carpenter. And this is when Mary gets the message from the angel that she's going to become pregnant with this child. And so she does. And when Joseph comes back, she's showing. And he's shocked. He thinks that, he hasn't protected her properly, and he feels really ashamed, and he wants to cut off the engagement. But an angel tells him in the dream, it's okay, you can trust her, this is God's child, and so on. But the priest sees this, and he decides that she needs to undergo the ordeal of the bitter water. So this was an ordeal that usually would have happened to women who were accused of cheating on their wives, and they would be forced to drink a substance that was likely holy water mixed with herbs that had some hallucinogenic effect and possibly also could facilitate an abortion. So the idea was, if a woman had cheated on her husband, they needed to get rid of any child that was in there that didn't belong to him because, again, patriarchal lines, super important. So you may or may not remember in Dune 2, there is a moment where Jessica essentially undergoes the ordeal of the bitter water. They want her to become the Reverend Mother of the Fremen, but she has to go through this test of drinking the poison, which comes from the sandworms, and survive that. that, or die. And so Mary and Jessica essentially go through the same thing. After Mary takes this poison, she quote unquote goes into the wilderness and then returns unharmed, which I think is a metaphor for getting really high, having kind of a trip, and then returning safely. And this is the same thing that happens to Lady Jessica in Dune 2. She has a very severe hallucinogenic experience where she kind of gets all of this knowledge, all of these downloads of, all of the Reverend Mothers that have come before her, and she does indeed survive this ordeal and gets to the other side. And so when Mary does that, the priest is like, okay, I believe you, go, be free, do your thing. And same thing with Lady Jessica. Once she survives that ordeal, that's when she's sort of accepted as the Bene Gesserit of the Fremen, and they take her on as the Reverend Mother. So I thought that was a really interesting parallel that seemed like drawn straight from that biblical story. There's also an interesting parallel here between the Virgin Mary story and Dune 2, which is around the temple virgins. So, again, the temple virgins in this context would have been servants of God. In Dune 2, there are sisters who are essentially servants of the Bene Gesserit. It's not really God, but it sort of is this religious order. And what they do is they go and breed essentially with who the Bene Gesserit tells them to breed with. And so they're creating children for the purposes of the Bene Gesserit. So what I think is interesting about this is that in the pre-patriarchal goddess religions that I learned about, specifically in Inanna's cult or religion or whatever you want to call it, there would be temple priestesses who were not virgins in the traditional sense of the word. Sometimes they're called hierodules or sacred prostitutes, which is a bit of a derogatory term. I think that's not quite what it was. So there would be these women who would live in the temple, and they would call men from the outside to join them to perform the sacred marriage. The sacred marriage was the coming together of man and woman as a metaphor of God and goddess coming together, goddess and earth, bull and cow, creating the fertility of the earth. And so the sacred marriage would be this way of creating children for the community. Theoretically, again, we don't know exactly how this worked, but there is certainly evidence of these women who would call men into the temple and create children with them. And so there is a sister at a certain point in Dune 2 who essentially does this for the purpose of the Bene Gesserit. She goes and breeds with Feyd-Rautha, and she kind of says like, oh, it's a girl, just like you requested, because they have those powers. So I think that's a really interesting inversion of the temple virgin or temple hierodule archetype, which may or may not have been, empowering for women. Again, we don't know exactly what that meant, but we're pretty sure, according to the evidence, that was definitely something that happened. I will also say the word virgin is interesting because originally it didn't mean never had sex before. There are a bunch of goddesses that are called virgin goddesses who obviously had consorts. Like Isis, I believe, was a virgin goddess. Hera was a virgin goddess. Artemis was one, though she never had a consort. And the idea here was more that virgin meant something like one unto herself, like she doesn't sort of need somebody else to do her thing. And so that whole concept of temple virgins, like, okay, what did that mean exactly? Like they were doing the work of god or goddess as one unto themselves. I think that's a really interesting parallel, the way those concepts come together here. So the Madonna Secret is a really fascinating look at these religious concepts from a feminine voice and also from a voice that's more connected to the earth and the land. And again, I'll kind of come back to this tragedy of, if that greater good at the end of it all is flooding Arrakis with water, losing the spice, losing the sandworms that die almost instantly when they come into contact with water, is that really the greatest good of all of this, right? And so I think that's really a message that the Madonna Secret gives quite beautifully and complexly. It's a long book. There's a lot in it. And, I listened to the audiobook. I was really sort of immersed in the poetry of it for a long time. I highly recommend this book. It's so, so interesting. But the point of it is to see the kingdom in the now, to not be waiting for that Messiah or that Savior to make things different for you, but to really be with what's actually happening at the moment. So, I'm not wanting to say here that religion is bad, or that spirituality is bad, or that God or goddess is bad, or any of that. I think it's so complex, and there's so much that we can't know about these different cultures and how they may have worked. I think in these fictionalized versions of the Messiah story, it's definitely getting criticized. We're looking at how that power is being misused. And, you know, in my experience with the authority and the power of the Christian church, yes, there's been a lot of damage that's been done there for the sake of power, essentially. But that doesn't mean that the spirituality at the heart of it isn't really valuable. So I think that's just something to look at here. You know, if we're thinking of spirituality from maybe more of an indigenous lens, where it's about listening rather than, you know, doing what someone tells you to do, or telling someone else what you think they should do. And this is something that comes up with my clients every now and then, where, you know, I work a lot with parts, the idea that we have different parts of ourselves that may or may not agree all the time. And a lot of the time we want to tell those parts what to do. We want to say, you know, sit back because I'm trying to, you know, do this thing and you're not helping me. But our bodies don't work like that, right? And that's a very colonial energy to tell our parts, like, you don't belong here, you shouldn't be doing that, I know what's best for you. Because when we really start doing this work, again, from that perspective of like, what if I could listen? What if I could learn from these parts of myself? Then, you know, I don't know, 100% of the time we learn that that part has a really important reason and a really important purpose that we need to listen to. We might need to adjust how we interact with that part, or, you know, how it's working for us or whatever it might be. But ultimately we do have something to learn from that. So a big practice that I'm doing when I'm working with my clients, and that I've worked on with myself, is, you know, trusting the system, trusting the ecosystem of selves, right? The kingdom is here, you know, not trying to come from this really mental place of like, well, here's what I want, here's my goal, here's what's getting in my way, so let's destroy that and just go for what I want. Like, what if we could see what's already working and sit with that? So I think that's really the lesson that I'm kind of pulling through with these different narratives of the Messiah savior, the colonial attitudes, you know, plus all this interesting folklore about, you know, the history of the ancient goddess. So those are some of my thoughts about Dune and the Madonna Secret by Sophie Strand. I hope you enjoyed that. And remember that you can get in touch with me through my website, juliepeters.ca. You can sign up for counseling with me if you want to, or a tarot reading. You can follow me at Popcorn Therapy on TikTok, at Julie Peters Wellness on Instagram. Lots of resources out there for you to look at just to think about these things a little bit more deeply. So feel free to be in touch. I'd love to know your thoughts and feedback about all this. Tell me what I missed. I'm sure many of you know way more about the folklore of Dune and other things than I do, so I would love to hear your thoughts as well. And I'll see you next time.
Soundstripe.